Kris Krane. Kris Krane of 4Front Advisors joins us to discuss how the history of adult use legislation will affect the current ballot initiatives and the East Coast in general. Welcome to Cannabis Economy. I'm your host, Seth Adler. Check us out on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and our new YouTube channel with the handle Can Economy. That's two N's in the word economy. Not sure how you're accessing this, but please know you can get us through the new Cannabis Economy app in iTunes, through the iTunes podcast app, and Google Play. Kris also takes us through his thinking on how this unique presidential election will play out for cannabis. The audio on Kris's side is not perfect, so thank you for bearing with us on that. But to that end, the content is perfect. So enjoy former SSDPer Kris Krane. So it's a pleasure because we have one of the very few cannabis lifers, Kris Krane. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's great to be back, Seth.
Thank you so much, for coming back. It's been about, it's been too long. Let's just say that. And just to catch folks up, Kris Krane, former SSDP, joined Canby, which was basically a veritable all-star cast of cannabis execs, and then that for all intents and purposes, became 4Front Advisors, which is where you are now. Is that a fair kind of recollection of your past?
Yes, yeah, definitely. A little more complicated than that, but I think for these purposes, more than enough info.
As far as Canby is concerned, give us a sense, you did talk about it the first time, but give us a sense of the players that were involved in that. This is kind of late 2009, 2010.
Sure. So Canby was founded by 5 partners originally. I was not one of those. It was Steve D'Angelo, who I think listeners of this podcast should be plenty familiar with, is the owner of Harborside Health Center in Oakland.
Indeed.
As well as Robert Jacob, who at the time was running a dispensary called Peace in Medicine out of Sebastopol, California. And Eric Pearson, who was the owner of Spark in San Francisco, which actually started, they opened the dispensary after we'd started Canby, so they kind of opened on some of our the earlier versions of our operating model. And then Don Duncan, the California director of Americans for Safe Access, as well as James Anthony, a well-known medical cannabis lawyer out of the Bay Area with a long land use law history.
It's just an unbelievable list of folks, and really what you guys were doing there is what you're doing now with 4Front, and that's why we wanted to go ahead and get a sense of what's happening nationally and specifically in certain states, because you are working in so many different geographies.
No, that makes sense, and it was, Canby when we were working there was largely California focused operation, but this was also in 2009, early 2010, and there really wasn't much going on outside of California and Colorado. We did do a little bit of work in Rhode Island at that time, but primarily we were focused on the California market, which frankly, ultimately, I think was one of the things that led to Canby's ultimate demise. That we started it during the first wave of the green rush, and then more crackdown started in California under the first term of the Obama administration. There was a lot more uncertainty in the market at that point, and it was one of the lessons that we learned when we started 4Front was. We really wanted to focus on states that had really strict and robust regulatory environments because, according to, at least at that point, we only had to work off of the Cole memos, that it was pretty clear that was what would provide a comfortable enough degree of protection for these business owners and therefore to their consultants as well, to make sure that this could be a sustainable, longer-lasting business model.
As far as California, let's come right back to it. We've got AB 266 within MRSA. Give us your sense of the latest. We've spoken with some operators on the ground. We've spoken with Amanda Ryman from the DPA. From your perspective, helping operators, how are those regulations going? I'll ask it very generally.
Well, to be honest, it's hard to say at this point because they're not in effect yet. So I think a lot of people have really strong opinions one way or another. There's certainly a lot of folks who feel that this is going to be a death knell to the industry in California, while others feel it's going to be a tremendous boom to the industry. And I think the reality is we don't know. The regulations don't go into effect until next year. What it has led to in the short term in California is sort of a local land grab of sorts. In that the way that this was set up. And this was done, I think, in large part as a nod to the fact that so many places had been operational and many in compliance with their local regulations for many, many years, California, of course, being the first medical marijuana state, that in order to get one of the state licenses that'll be available next year, you first have to obtain a license from the local jurisdiction that you plan to operate in. And so, the vast majority of cities and counties and towns in California don't have any regulatory ordinances in place, or haven't put any regulatory ordinances in place. There are places like San Francisco and Berkeley and Oakland and West Hollywood and Sebastopol and a number of places around the state that have done a really terrific job at not only regulating cannabis businesses, but really serving as pioneers of cannabis regulations for the country. But the overwhelming majority of jurisdictions in California have not done so. And so these cities, towns, and counties all across the state are now rushing to implement. Well, first, many of them rush to ban. Now that's no longer going to be allowed. So they're rushing to implement these regulatory ordinances and zoning ordinances. And so there's going to be a little bit of sort of like I said, a land grab of sorts where people are going for these local licenses, which will become the precursor to state licensing next year. So we'll have to see how this all plays out. I do think it will be disruptive to the market as we know it. And so some of the fears about existing operators having a hard time complying, I think some of those will wind up being founded. Some of them not so much. But it's when I think about small scale growers in Northern California, for example, who have lived off the grid for a long time, those types of folks are going to have a really difficult choice to make. Right? They're going to have to decide: do they want to become legitimate and fully legal within this new system, or continue to operate the way that they have, more in the shadows, where continuing to go the way that they have is likely the more lucrative option, since a lot of these folks grow and then they sell it to folks who are taking it out of state, where pounds fetch a much higher price than they would selling within this much more closed loop California only market that they would be forced to participate in should they decide to get a state license.
And we're, just to be clear, not talking about those home grow folks. These are folks with certainly larger operations than a few plants.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are a lot of mid-size, you could call them, cultivators, particularly up in the Emerald Triangle in California, who, I mean, they derive a substantial portion, if not all, of their income from the sale of cannabis, and I don't fault them at all for that. I mean, this is not a negative judgment against them. There are millions of cannabis consumers around the United States who should be very grateful for the activity that these folks have engaged in, at their own peril, frankly, for many years. And it would be a real shame to see these folks be pushed out of the industry when regulation comes along. But at the same time, complying with a legal and regulated market means making some changes to the way you're doing business or conducting business, and there are there are going to be some real pressures for folks to stay in the black market, because again, as long as marijuana is still illegal around the rest of the country, they're going to fetch a much higher dollar per pound than they will shipping out of state than they will keeping it within the confines of a highly regulated California market.
Indeed. And if you don't mind, really, we would love to go state by state, and not necessarily those cultivators, but more the operators that you spoke about, folks with established dispensaries and businesses. When we look to Washington State as far as kind of re-regulating itself and having established businesses have to reapply for licenses, it has not been smooth in Washington, and even as recently as now, it's not been smooth. Do you have thoughts on Washington State? Let's start there.
I think, I'd actually sort of take it back to California for a second because I think it's a really good contrast.
Yeah.
I think when they were drafting the regulations around medical marijuana and the ALMA, the initiative regulations largely mirror these. I think they were looking at what happened in Washington.
Right.
Where you had this large network of sort of gray market dispensaries, you could call it, throughout the state that it was difficult to get them to just transition to new straight up legal stores because they weren't ever regulated by the state in the first place, right? These were not places that had a license from the state of Washington to be operating as medical marijuana dispensaries, which was the case in Colorado. And I think that's part of the reason why Colorado's transition was a lot smoother, because you had these businesses that were already operating under the purview of the Marijuana Enforcement Division in the state of Colorado. And so it was relatively easy to transition those businesses. Whereas in Washington and in California, you have loads of businesses throughout the state that are operating in somewhat of a gray market, is certainly without any state regulatory oversight. So much more difficult than to say, well, you guys have been operating for years and we're just going to transition you over. The state, as far as they knew, didn't know any of these businesses. They didn't have any operating history as far as the state was concerned. Right. What you had was basically the state in Washington where they, I think, messed up was that they simply ignored the fact that these businesses existed and just asked for entirely new applications from everybody. And they were treated the same as everyone else.
Absolutely. And that is what did happen. What I'm talking about now is the kind of the re-regulation for July 1st, 2017. Folks having to get back in order and reapply and do it. Let's do it all again.
Yeah, I mean, that's just kind of silly. I mean, having to reapply is kind of ridiculous. I mean, in most states, in most of these markets, you do have to submit it's not a reapplication, it's not a new application, but you do have to go back to the state and renew your license. That is the case in a lot of places. And that's fairly standard with heavily regulated businesses. Just, hey, come back every couple of years and show that you've been in compliance with our regulations. And if you have, you're going to get relicensed. So that, something like that, I don't have an issue with saying, hey, we're just going to start this all over again. Doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. I do think, though, when you look at California, what they're trying to do does make sense. Whether it's going to work is a different question. But there are a lot of businesses throughout the state that are operating in clear compliance with their city and their city or county government regulations, and those folks should certainly not be at a disadvantage when it comes to being allowed to stay open and now comply with new state regulations. If they've been in good standing at the city or at the county level, which is the only level you could be in good standing at until recently, they should have an advantage there. And that's, I think, what they tried to do by saying, look, if you have a city or state license, you're going to be essentially first in line to get a state license. It's something that Washington, I think, would have been wiser to have done than what they have been, and it's led to a much more difficult time getting their house in order after you sort of started the wrong way.
Yeah, indeed. And talking about a state that has learned from both California's past and present, as well as Washington's approach to the whole thing, Oregon, it does seem like if there's a place where it's going smoothly, it's Oregon.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Oregon, I think, handled this really wisely. First of all, they had their shakeout well before the adult use initiative passed, in that they went through medical marijuana licensing a couple of years earlier, and so those stores had been licensed and got up and running. We have to remember, if you go back before that, Oregon also had a number of gray market dispensaries. They were mostly called cannabis clubs there, but you had a number of businesses that were operational in Oregon that were less legal than most in California, I would say, because I don't think any of them were operating with a city or municipal license. And so the state had that shakeout when they went through their medical business licensing, where many of those gray market businesses did not get licensed. Some of them did, but they had that shakeout early. And then because they went through that and they did it relatively effectively, when adult use came, they just said, okay, if you have a medical license, you've already got a business, you've shown us that you're responsible and you can handle the product, you're all just adult use licensees now. You can just sell to everybody. And that was I think a smart and fair way to handle it. They then, of course, are opening up to more applications. So it's not only going to be limited, forever to the first medical license holders, but they're now opening it up to others. So I think that was smart. Now you don't have to distinguish which of these medical license holders can participate or not. They just said, hey, blanket statement, you all can now sell for adult use purposes, and you're going to have some more competition down the road from anyone else who wants to enter the market. It's a much more free market approach. Yeah.
Very free market approach, certainly. You mentioned Colorado. I think that you've told us in the past that you kind of stay away from that to lend your insight and intellect in other regions. So just to round out the adult use states, what's the latest from Alaska, whether you've got clients there or not, as far as you're concerned?
Sure. So we don't have clients there at the moment. We haven't closed the door to working with anyone there, but their residency requirement rules are really, really, really strict from what we can tell. In fact, I think that's probably going to be the biggest challenge that they have to face in that market. It's also extremely remote, so it hasn't been a place that we've spent a ton of time focusing our energy. We have a lot of opportunities, obviously, in front of us here, and Alaska being, it's just difficult logistically to work there. So if we have the right opportunity, we're definitely open to it, and would like to do so, but hasn't been a big area of focus. That said, the regulations do seem to be rounding out. On the whole, they seem decent. I like that they seem to be moving towards places that allow on-site consumption. But the residency requirements there, particularly, the residency requirements even around investment are extremely strict. And I think that's going to be problematic, even more so than we've seen in a state like Colorado, for example, just because there simply aren't that many people. And there isn't that much money in Alaska. I was talking to a business reporter out of the state a few months back, and he was sort of lamenting that with the amount of money that's going to be necessary to build out the cultivation infrastructure to meet market demand in Alaska, there's something like 5 families in the state that could realistically afford to fund that. It's just not a state with a ton of institutional money, and you have to assume that most of those folks are not necessarily interested in this market. So I think that this might lead to supply issues down the road. May lead to some really seriously bootstrapped operations that wind up having some operational problems, and I am a bit concerned about the residency requirements there being overly restrictive and overly strict to the point of stifling the program. Outside of that, I think the regulations they're setting up are largely par for the course and should be fine.
Yeah. No, I had the chance to talk to Cindy Franklin, who is kind of running the regulatory body. And she was very clear in saying whatever we're going to set up is going to be truly Alaskan. And so it sounds like she made good on that promise.
No, that's right. And look, I'm sympathetic in general to any state wanting to make sure that the folks in their state benefit from this and get first crack at this. What politician wouldn't want to bring jobs and money to their state?
Of course.
And you also are dealing with something that's federally illegal, and one of the best ways to avoid diverting medicine or diverting product to across state lines or to other markets is to have it run by folks within the state. So I understand all that, and I'm sympathetic to it. I just think there should, there needs to be sort of reasonable policies around, particularly outside investment, in order to make sure that these things can actually run effectively. And in a state as small as Alaska from a population standpoint, that might be more of a challenge than we would face in some other states.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And plus, there are many cities that don't have roads that go to them.
That's
you
right.
have to get there by either air or sea.
That's right.
So,
that's right.
So let's focus, more on states that do have road transportation. Why not start with Massachusetts? That's a state you hold near and dear, right?
It is my current home state. Lived here for almost 2 years now, and have been spending a lot of time here before that. So yes, very much so. I've been, I'm a resident now and love Massachusetts, despite some of the issues we've had with the program here. On the whole, I'm still extremely optimistic about Massachusetts and the Massachusetts market in particular moving into the future.
Well, what are the key differences between the way taking the kind of New England and Eastern Seaboard approach? What are the key differences that you see, in regulations or from an operator's perspective in the East versus the West?
I think in the East, things tend to be more tightly regulated than out West. And I don't say that necessarily as a good thing. But we love our regulations here on the East Coast, and you've got these large bureaucratic institutions and bigger political machines on the East Coast than you tend to have on the West Coast. And so the scrutiny that these programs tend to receive from their health departments or their regulatory oversight agencies, I feel tends to be quite a bit stricter than what we often see out west, where they tend to move a little bit faster. In many ways, it's a little bit more business friendly out west. That said, for those who can navigate these regulatory environments in the East Coast, I think they're going to be very well rewarded for their efforts and their diligence.
Well, why do you say that?
So I look at a state like Massachusetts in particular, and since we're talking about Mass, first we'll stick just to the medical program first, and then we can move on to the adult use. But the medical marijuana program here is a vertically integrated market, which has its pros and cons, obviously. But the pros of that system are that your margins tend to be quite a bit better, and the prices for the patients wind up coming down because your cost of goods sold is your cost of production. So first of all, just having a vertically integrated market, I think will tend to be good for the business operators. But they're also because it's so challenging to go through the licensing process here and to navigate the bureaucracy, and even in Massachusetts, where we're currently going through a second round of applications after there were 17 granted in the first round, and there's no longer a cap on the number of licenses. It's a really challenging process. It takes about a year or so to get all the way through the licensing process here. So we don't expect that there's going to be the volume of dispensaries in Massachusetts that we see in Oregon or Colorado, for example, or even Washington. There should be a relatively limited number. Limited, I think, when it's all said and done, being somewhere between 75 and 125 dispensaries for the state. So not a small enough number that the patients will suffer from lack of access, but not a huge number where there's massive amounts of competition. I actually think it's kind of a happy medium where the businesses should do really well, particularly those that are in the more populated metro areas, which is the bulk of the state in Massachusetts. But still having good access for the patients. I look at the businesses that are being established here for medical, and I think those, particularly in the high density areas, are going to do extremely well, probably better than your average business in a lot of the western states.
Yeah, and what is the patient count as far as Massachusetts?
The patient count at last blush, I think, was about 30,000, somewhere around 30, 35,000.
Okay.
So it's been rising steadily. We do anticipate that number when it gets to its peak, which we think will be in year 3 or so of the program, should be closer to 150,000. That would represent just over 2% of the population, which is around what we see in states with similar qualifying condition lists. The reason that it's been slow to roll out is because the dispensaries have been slow to roll out. And what we see in almost every state is that the patient population tends to be small, even when there's an ability to get a patient card, until dispensaries start opening, until there are access points. And in a state like Massachusetts in particular, Massachusetts has such a strong decriminalization law. It's a $100 civil offense if you get caught with less than an ounce of marijuana by the police. Just on-the-spot fine, no criminal record, no criminal penalties. It costs close to $300 to go to a doctor and get a card and register with the state. So really, you have to get busted 3 times in a calendar year for it to be cost effective for you to go get a patient card. And the program's been very slow to roll out in terms of getting these dispensaries up and running. They just started getting operational about 7-8 months ago, and there's only 6 still open in the entire state, and only 1 right now in the immediate Boston metro area, and that's where obviously the bulk of the population is in the state. So as these next generation or next rounds of dispensaries start getting open, the remainder of the first round and now some of these second rounders, and there are a lot more in the populated areas of the states. We expect that patient population to ramp up significantly.
Yeah. Slowly but surely, kind of one dispensary at a time almost.
It literally has been one dispensary at a time here, although I think by the end of this year and into early next year, we're going to see a big increase in the number of dispensaries because of this second round. And then, of course, adult use is on the ballot in November, and we expect it to pass. Very hopeful it's going to pass. And there is, like in virtually every other state, there's a buffer period given to the existing medical license holders. It's 1 year for dispensaries and production facilities, and 2 years for cultivation. And when I look at the business opportunity for Massachusetts under adult use, I think it's massive. I actually think there's a real possibility that Massachusetts becomes the largest marijuana market in the United States, potentially by maybe not by a wide margin when you compare California, but I do think this could be these could be some of the most successful businesses and really one of the largest markets. And I say that because of geography more than anything else.
How so?
Well, you look at Colorado and Washington, for example, and even Oregon, or you look at all the adult use states to date, and we've seen a marked increase in tourism, especially in Colorado, which has gotten most of the headlines, but even in Seattle. So Denver and Seattle have seen upticks in tourism. Denver, in particular, largely driven by marijuana being legally available in those cities. Well, when you look at it geographically, nothing is near Denver. There's nothing near Seattle. There's nothing near Portland. And when I say nothing near, I mean there are no population centers within, say, a 5 to 6 hour drive. You got to drive really far to get to another major population area. And there's virtually nothing in between, right? There's no major center. There's not like huge sprawling suburbs with lots and lots of population. These are what you're dealing with the West Coast here. You've got a lot more sort of sprawling rural areas. And yet you still see this increase in tourism in Denver, and it's hard to get there, right? People have to fly. Whereas you look at Massachusetts, and Massachusetts is likely going to be, if not the only, certainly one of a small handful of legal states in the Northeast. It'll probably be the only legal states in the Northeast for quite a while, because basically all the initiative states will be exhausted. And so you may have legal marijuana in Vermont or Rhode Island, maybe in Maine. But to get to Maine or to get to Vermont, you've got to drive through Massachusetts. And really, very few people are going on vacation to Providence, Rhode Island. It's also just as easy to get to as some areas of Massachusetts. But you look at what's close to Massachusetts. I mean, I haven't done the exact math, but I would venture to guess that you've got somewhere between 30 to 40 million people within a 5 to 6 hour drive of the Massachusetts borders. Even New York City is only 2.5 hours from Springfield, Mass.
Well, certainly, yeah.
So you've got a much larger population that is readily available to drive, to take a weekend trip, to take a day trip to Massachusetts to enjoy cannabis, and also when somebody goes to Colorado and they want to go home, they got to fly, and so people are going to be a little more reticent to load up on cannabis, particularly cannabis flowers, and put it in their bags and get on an airplane. But somebody driving up to Massachusetts, say from New York City, and driving up to Massachusetts, they might buy themselves a couple ounces or a few ounces and drive back down to New York. And you also got to recognize too, when you're dealing with the states around Massachusetts compared to the states around Colorado, Massachusetts is surrounded entirely by decrim states. You can drive from New York up to Massachusetts, and in every single one of those states, if you were to get caught, you're in a decrim state, right? You're not going to be facing any major serious penalties. Whereas you leave the borders of Colorado, and you're driving into some states where you're looking at potential felonies for having any even relatively small quantities of marijuana.
Right. Yeah. Just speaking of the four corners, Utah ain't so friendly.
That's exactly right. Neither is Nebraska. Right. So you're not looking at a lot of friendly neighbors there. Whereas in Massachusetts here, it's a different story. So I think from a cannabis tourism perspective, I think you're looking at something the likes of which we really haven't seen yet.
Yeah, you touched on the medical states that do surround Massachusetts. You left New Hampshire off, unless I missed it. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, it's a small program. There's only 4 licenses, I think. But any thoughts there?
Well, I was referring more to other states that are looking at legal adult use, and so you're
Got it.
yeah.
Okay,
So it's
enough.
Maine
Yeah.
may have an initiative on the ballot, although it looks like they now have to sue to make that happen. So that's looking less likely. But Vermont and Rhode Island are both currently debating legalization bills in the legislature, and I think one, if not both, will pass this year. If not this year, then probably next year. So I think that's going to be your universe of adult use states for the near future. New Hampshire, though, does have a medical program. In fact, I think at this point all of New England does, right? Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, we all have medical programs in place. New Hampshire's is the least developed so far, but that's only because they granted their licenses last year. They granted 4 licenses for the state. None of them are open yet, but they should be opening first or second quarter of this year, from what I understand.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's go to the rest of the ballot, if you will. Various ballot initiatives for adult use across the country. You talked about Maine and Rhode Island and Vermont. What is your we already talked about California. Let's leave that alone. What's your next area of focus as far as a state that has adult use on the ballot?
I'm paying really close attention to, in particular, to Nevada and Arizona. Those are the ones that I think we need to keep the closest eye on. Obviously, for personal reasons, deeply involved in what's going on in Massachusetts, and very interested in obviously in seeing that one be successful. But when I look at the landscape of initiatives for the coming year, Nevada and Arizona are the ones that really interest me the most, and I think that we need to watch most closely. Those are the ones that are polling the closest, according to the initial polling. They're the most conservative states that we've ever run initiatives in. Alaska notwithstanding, although Alaska's really hard to place on the sort of liberal to conservative spectrum. It's very sort of libertarian.
Yeah, I was going to say personal liberties. It's a totally different kind of animal. But go on.
Yeah. It's very frontier. So you're looking at Arizona. It's a relatively conservative state, my last home state. So I also have a personal interest there. I've been involved in the periphery in that campaign. And Nevada, I think, will be a really interesting one, also for tourism reasons. I mean, you look at how much tourism there is just naturally in Las Vegas, in the Vegas area, and that presents some really, really interesting market opportunities, particularly for those folks who have licenses already under the adult use model, or under the medical market. So I think those are going to be the ones to watch. I think there's a decent chance that we can win both of them, but I think it will largely depend on how much money the opposition is able to raise in each of those states. And I worry specifically about Sheldon Adelson,
Right.
The casino magnate from Las Vegas, big time Republican donor. He's not been a friend to this issue, and this is in his backyard. He did actually put money into opposing legalization when it was on the ballot all the way back in 2006. When it did fail, and he did put I think a couple $1 million into helping to defeat Florida in 2014 under medical. So I wonder how much he's willing to put up, if any. I think he probably will. But if he puts up $500,000, that's beatable. If he puts up $10 million, we're gonna have a really hard time. And I think we're looking at a similar situation in Arizona, where I don't see as much moneyed opposition. But I think that's also, when I look at the 4 or 5 states that are likely to have adult use on the ballot, that's also the one where we're starting off from sort of the worst polling position. If we can win. If we win Arizona and Nevada, then we've likely won all 4 or all 5 states. In which case, that's a real watershed moment for this industry. I mean, I don't think that if we win all, if we run the table and we win all these states, our opposition can't credibly claim that this is still a legitimate political debate. We'll have won every time it's been put to the voters. We'll have won in conservative states and liberal states and purple states and blue states. And I just don't see any way that our opposition can say that this is even a valid political argument anymore. I think we'll be able to claim that from a political debate standpoint that we've won.
Yeah. Having said that, what does happen, do you think, to the dialogue, to the conversation, if Arizona or Nevada or both don't go the way that we'd prefer?
I think at that point the conversation might take a little bit longer. My biggest worry when I look at this from a political or political science standpoint, my biggest fear would be that we win California, we win Massachusetts and hopefully Maine if they can get on the ballot, and we lose Nevada and Arizona, and that this that makes this a more partisan political issue. Because I think you could then make the argument that, look, Republican states or conservative states have rejected this, and blue or Democratic states have accepted it, and that could embolden Republicans to become more opposed to this issue. It could also embolden Democrats to become more in favor of it, which that's obviously fine. Right. We want more folks in favor, but I wouldn't like to see this become a hardened political issue or partisan issue, particularly given that over the last decade or so it really hasn't been. You've got the libertarian leaning Republicans who have been very much on our side, the Rand Pauls of the world, the Dana Rohrbachers of the world, and so we've actually done quite well with many. With many on the Republican Party, and this just hasn't been seen as a partisan issue, and it would be a shame to see it become that. This is another reason why I think it's so important that we win at least one of Nevada and Arizona.
Interesting. And so, what are you doing? You said you're on the periphery in Arizona. What would you suggest folks do if they're either in the industry or interested in the industry succeeding? While we have a minute.
Well, I mean, first and foremost would be donate money to the campaign, particularly if you're in the industry and you're making money off of this. If you're in the industry and you're in Arizona, you have to be donating to the campaign. But I think if you're in the industry in general and you want to see this happen more quickly nationally, I think supporting the initiatives in Arizona and Nevada would be a really wise way to spend some money today that could lead to a lot more opportunities outside of those two states in the future. So donating money, donating time, encouraging folks that you work with to volunteer time. And the great thing with campaigns these days is you can volunteer time from anywhere in the country. You don't have to be in Arizona to volunteer to help the Arizona initiative. You can volunteer from your home and anywhere in the country. You can phone bank, right? The campaign will send you scripts. They'll send you numbers of registered voters who they think are potential supporters, and you can do things like phone banking. You can volunteer 2 hours a week and just make phone calls to folks in these very important states, and those calls, particularly calls from folks who actually are passionate about the issue and care about the issue, and not just a paid robocaller or a paid canvasser, they are a lot more effective, right? People feed on that enthusiasm. They can tell that you really care, that you're really interested in this, and it's motivating to folks rather than somebody who's just calling and reading a script, and the next day they might be calling and reading a script on gun rights, and the next day on GMO labeling or whatever it is. I mean, they're paid by whatever campaign is paying them to make calls. Those calls that come from actual supporters of the initiative, people who really care, tend to be a lot more effective in mobilizing voters.
We haven't talked about Florida. Should we talk about Florida?
Sure. Hugely important state this year.
What are your thoughts? I mean, they've got the nursery thing, but now we've got the signatures that we need. It looks like we're all right. Talk about what your thoughts are.
Sure. Well, I mean, look, on the nursery bill, the CBD, I mean, that bill's kind of a joke, unfortunately. I mean, hopefully there will be some very sick kids who can benefit from the high CBD medication that some of these folks are going to produce. But as far as, it's not really a medical marijuana law. It's so ridiculously limited, and so limited in who can even apply for these licenses.
Well, that's what I mean by the nursery thing. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It was, the applications were limited to anybody who had been a nursery owner for 30 years or longer in Florida. And for those who don't know, we're not talking about daycare nurseries. We're talking about flower nurseries. That would have been a little bit more odd, although not too much. But we are looking now at a real medical marijuana initiative on the ballot this November. It will look a lot like the initiative that failed 2 years ago, with some tweaks to adjust some of the criticism that initiative faced. And I think, if I were a betting man, I would probably bet it's going to pass. I don't think this is going to be a landslide victory. Well, that's it. I think it's going to be a landslide election. I don't think it's going to be a landslide victory. The last one was a landslide election. We lost with 57.5%. And so that, 57.5% in virtually any election is considered a landslide. Right. And yet in Florida, it's considered a loss. Because in Florida, you need 60% to win. Yeah. But that said, we did get 57.5% in 2014. That was a non-presidential election, where typically we do worse in off-year elections than we do in presidential elections. Usually to the tune of somewhere between 2 to 4 percentage points that we tend to gain just from moving to a presidential election. And so that alone would basically put us right at or above 50%. And it was also a Republican wave year election where turnout amongst progressive voters was really down, and so I think just and we've also of course had 2 more years of full legalization being implemented without a whole lot of problems around the country, and I think the country has moved more in favor in the last 2 years. So all of those factors would lead me to believe that this initiative has a good chance of passing, and if it does, I think that's huge. I mean, Florida will then have a real and robust medical marijuana market. You'll have marijuana being grown and sold legally in the state of Florida. This would be the first real southern state to do this, although you can take issue with how southern a state Florida really is. What they say about Florida, right? The further south you go, the further north you get. But this will be happening in Florida. It is a massively important state in the South and in Southern politics, and that's a region that we've had a very difficult time achieving any kind of substantial reform on this issue. So having a legal marketplace in a southern state like Florida, and you go up to the Florida Panhandle and it's real southern, and this will be up there too. I think this could have a tremendous impact, and not to mention the fact that it's just a massive state with a ton of people, and would dramatically increase the amount of legal cannabis business that's being done in the country.
Yeah, you brought up electoral politics. I don't want to talk about politics, but I do want to talk about the fact that this is shaping up to be an extremely unique election. And you mentioned generally we do better in a presidential election. Generally is not what's happening this year, or it doesn't look like it's going to be generally what happens. Do you have thoughts on the way that it looks like voters are behaving? We've got 2 distinct candidates that aren't playing by what the general knowledge set is. It looks like one will be on the ballot, one maybe won't. Who knows? We'll see. But with that kind of, fervor, how do you think that's going to affect cannabis on the ballot?
As you stated correctly, there's really nothing usual about this election cycle. And so I think, particularly if Donald Trump is the nominee for the Republicans, a lot of what we consider conventional political wisdom sort of goes out the window for this election. I don't think Bernie Sanders is going to be the Democratic nominee. I look at this stuff very wonkily. So my own personal preferences aside, I don't think Hillary's delegate count is surmountable, or delegate lead is surmountable. So I think you're going to have one very conventional candidate for the Democrats, and arguably the most unconventional candidate that we've ever seen, certainly within any of our lifetimes, on the Republican side. So hard to say entirely. All that said, though, my gut feeling is I don't think that a Trump being the nominee is going to be particularly harmful to us at the ballot this year. In fact, if anything, it may actually be helpful. And this is not talking about a Trump presidency. This is just talking about a Trump candidacy. And the reason I say that is that on the, we do best demographically, we do best amongst the millennial voters, or the young voters, and they typically only turn out in presidential elections. And one thing that I would be quite concerned with normally with Hillary Clinton being the Democratic nominee is that she's not going to excite the youth base. Certainly not the way that Obama did. Certainly not the way he did in 2008. And so I would worry about the young voters staying home, which would hurt us. And she's also, she does best amongst older voters, which is our worst demographic. And they may be more, and older women in particular, which is by far our worst demographic. Women over 65 support legalization at lower rates than just about anybody. And those folks are likely going to come out in large numbers to vote for Hillary, and understandably so. The fact that Trump would be the Republican nominee, I think, is going to help solve Hillary's young voter turnout problem, because he's so deeply unpopular amongst young voters that I think they're likely going to turn out in larger numbers to vote against Donald Trump than they are to vote for Hillary. And when they're there, they're going to vote in favor of us. The other big question is, Trump seems to be turning out voters who otherwise might not vote, particularly white working class voters. Who often sit out these types of elections, who certainly wouldn't be excited by a Hillary and wouldn't be excited by any other traditional Republican nominee who may turn out and vote for Trump. But I don't think those are our opponents. These are not folks who are motivated by your sort of traditional Christian conservative moralist principles. A lot of these folks like cannabis, and so I don't and are somewhat libertarian minded as well. Have a real distrust of government. So I don't necessarily think that the voters that Trump is going to turn out who otherwise wouldn't turn out are going to be our opponents here. So in the end, I don't think that this particular nominee set hurts us. I think, if anything, it might help us. But again, this is my own political prognostication, someone who follows this stuff quite closely. But this is, as I acknowledge, a very different election year, and the reality is we don't really know.
Yeah. Well, the beautiful thing about you and I talking more than once is we can discuss this again after it happens, and then you can share why thoughts that you had were either right or wrong. How about that?
Then you can totally rub in why everything I said ended up being completely wrong, and nobody should ever listen to anything that I say when it comes to politics.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, once we're within the President Sanders administration, we'll give you a ring back. That type of thing.
I will gladly eat crow if that is the case.
There we go.
No problem at all.
It's not that you don't feel the burn, is the point.
That's right. I'm a political realist, and unfortunately, when I look at this year, Hillary's delegate lead right now is greater than Obama's was at this point in 2008, and I'm a big fan of Nate Silver's and 538, and really trying to look at this from a sort of a detached emotional perspective and just look at the math. And unfortunately, I think this is going to be Hillary's election. But barring an indictment on the email server thing or some just outrageous scandal, I do think that Hillary's in a very good position to get the nomination here.
Right, and our point in talking about this is exactly what you said, which is interestingly the coupling potentially of Trump and Clinton, maybe provides a nice platform for cannabis. So that's why we brought up the whole thing anyway.
It may, strangely, yeah. That's right. Although, look, if Sanders does pull off a minor miracle and get the nomination, I think he's also great for this issue. I mean, he's now I would say the best senator in the United States Senate on this issue, and that he's the only senator since the 1970s to have introduced a legalization bill. He's been really outspoken on criminal justice reform, and I think if he's the nominee, he makes this more of an issue in the presidential election. Whereas Hillary, I don't think Hillary wants to talk about this at all. I think criminal justice is it's a source. Yeah, you look at her husband's record. And you look at the heat she's taken from Black Lives Matter activists on their criminal justice record, and I think this is something she would rather avoid having to deal with.
So interesting. All right, so I hope you'll take me up on maybe talking right there at November 5th, 6th, 7th, and we'll kind of recap what just occurred.
You got it, and if we wind up with President Trump that day, we can swap stories on how we've booked our flights to Canada, and maybe meet up and record this next podcast in Vancouver.
There we go, Vancouver, a beautiful city. So I had asked you what has most surprised you questions the first time we chatted. I didn't ask you the soundtrack question, so this is going to be my final question, which is on the soundtrack of Kris Krane's life. What is one song, one track that must be on there?
Oh, boy. I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to this stuff. To picking Picking one song would be incredibly challenging.
Well, there was one that flew by there, so we can just take that and understand that there's obviously a whole lot more depth and breadth to your music taste. But what did fly by?
Boy, I'm gonna. It's a. If you ask me every day, I'd probably pick a different song. But I'm gonna pick a song. It's called Untitled 8. It was formerly known as Pop Song by Sigur Rós. Partly because they're probably my favorite band of all time, and I think their music is absolutely beautiful and gorgeous. But I really love the way that they build to this sort of symphonic sound. So it'll start really light and beautiful and sparse and sort of build up over the course of 8 to 9 minutes into this just gorgeous wall of sound, and then it all kind of stops with a flute, and I think that's if I have to listen to anything to get me excited, to help me pace myself, you're not looking for that wall of sound when you first get going. You're looking for a climax in anything that you're working on. I think it's in addition to just being an awesome song and absolutely beautiful, a nice way to approach life in general.
So kind of Beethoven meets Phil Spector.
Something like that, yes.
Kris Krane, thanks so much. Really appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Anytime. Thanks for having me, Seth.
And there you have Kris Krane. So we'll see how it all goes. Who even knows if those will be the two candidates that we're voting for in November. But very much appreciate Chris's point of view on all things cannabis. Hope you do too. And once again, we very much thank you for listening.